There is a unique and terrible loneliness that comes with the flashing blue and red lights on a deserted road. A feeling that you are the only bastion of order in a world that is vast, dark, and indifferent. We trust the law to be a shield against the chaos, but what happens when that shield is tested? What happens when an officer, alone on patrol, peers into the darkness and finds something staring back? Something that does not follow any law they have ever known. Tonight, we delve into the accounts of those who swore an oath to protect and serve only to find themselves utterly defenseless. In today's episode, I will be sharing 8 disturbing and allegedly true stories from law enforcement officers who faced the inexplicable and the terrifying while on duty. These are not tales of shootouts or criminal masterminds. They are stories of quiet roads that lead to nowhere, of silent figures that watch from the trees, and of secrets that should have remained buried. Prepare yourself, for among the tales we will uncover tonight, one deputy will answer a call to a remote home that has been meticulously staged as a trap, and another will stumble upon a ritual deep in the national forest, only to find the cultists know exactly who he is, and where he parks his car. The events you are about to hear are unsettling. The fear is real because the situations felt real to those who experienced them. For the best experience, turn down the lights and listen closely. And if these stories resonate with that primal fear inside you, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Dr. Bonechill for more true horror, and leave a comment telling us which story will stay with you in the dark. So secure the doors, and check the locks. Now let's get into it. Story 1: The Stillwater Road. My name is Marcus, and for 15 years I've been a deputy with the county sheriff's department. Most of our calls are predictable domestic disputes, traffic stops, the occasional bar fight. It's a job that can be tense, but it's grounded in a reality I understand. Or at least, it was. The call came in around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was a request for a civil standby at an address on Stillwater Road, deep in the unincorporated part of the county. The dispatcher noted the caller was a woman who sounded calm, almost serene. She stated she needed an officer present while she retrieved belongings from a family property. Nothing about it raised a red flag. It was boring, but it was the job. The first sign of trouble was my radio. The further I drove down Stillwater Road, the more the familiar crackle of dispatch devolved into a blanket of white noise. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a hard-packed dirt track that was barely wide enough for my patrol unit. My GPS had given up miles ago, showing my vehicle icon floating in a blank, green void. I was completely cut off. After another 10 minutes of crawling along the path, I passed an old man on a rusty tractor. Even though it was the middle of the night, he didn't wave. He just stopped his engine and watched me pass, his face a mask of grim disapproval. In my rearview mirror, I saw him make a small, sharp gesture with his hand, like he was warding something off. I dismissed it as the strange behavior of a rural recluse. When I finally found the address, it wasn't the run-down farmhouse I expected. It was a 2-story colonial, immaculately maintained. The lawn was perfectly manicured, and there wasn't a single leaf on the pristine white porch. It was uncanny, like a photograph. I got out of my car and the silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind. Nothing, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. The front door was unlocked. I announced myself, Sheriff's Department, but my voice felt swallowed by the house inside. The place was staged. The furniture was antique but looked brand new with no signs of use. There was no dust on the bookshelves, and the books themselves stood perfectly aligned, their spines uncreased. The only thing out of place was a vintage radio in the corner. Emitting the same low hiss of static as my own, I moved through the ground floor, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. It felt like a museum, or a tomb. I called out again, but the only answer was the static. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic humming coming from the second floor. It was a low, sorrowful sound, and I drew my service weapon, my heart pounding against my ribs. I ascended the stairs slowly, each step groaning under my weight. The humming led me to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. Inside, a single wooden rocking chair was moving back and forth in the center of the room, empty. The humming seemed to emanate from the very walls around me. On the nightstand was a single framed photograph. It was the old man from the tractor. His face was smiling, but someone had taken a pen and methodically, violently, blacked out his eyes. The humming stopped. The silence that rushed in was somehow worse, and then a woman's voice, calm and serene, just as the dispatcher had described, whispered directly behind my ear. "We're so glad you could make it. We called for you." I never turned around. I didn't see who, or what, had spoken. I ran, I bolted, From that room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not daring to look back, I threw myself into my patrol car and drove, my tires tearing up the dirt track as I fled. I didn't slow down until my radio crackled back to life and I heard the comforting, mundane voice of my dispatcher asking for a status update. Back at the station, I tried to make sense of it. I ran the property records for the address on Stillwater Road. The report was brief. The home had been owned by a family named Miller, who had vanished from public records in the 1970s. An internal note from a deputy decades ago mentioned local folklore, stories of a family that would lure lone travelers to their home with strange calls for help, and that those travelers were never seen again. The official call log for that night showed no record of the woman's request. As far as the system was concerned, I had simply gone for a drive. Story 2, The Tooth and Stone. My name is Alex, and I was a state trooper assigned to the 395, a long desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the eastern Sierras. My job was less about law enforcement and more about being a lifeline. I'd spend my shifts helping tourists with flat tires, checking on abandoned vehicles, and just generally making sure no one got into trouble in the vast emptiness. It's a lonely job, but there's a peace to it. You feel like you own the landscape, that you know its every curve and secret. I was wrong. The routine ended on a Wednesday night, during a standard sweep of a notorious turnout where people often dumped trash or abandoned cars. I found a beat-up sedan, decades old, sitting by the shoulder. It was empty, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what I found on its hood. Arranged in a perfect spiral pattern were dozens of small, polished river stones and what I immediately recognized as coyote teeth. It wasn't just a random pile. It was deliberate, almost artistic. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to some local teenagers with a strange sense of humor, or maybe some kind of new age ritual. I documented it, called for a tow, and tried to put it out of my mind. It was just a weird footnote to an otherwise boring shift. The real fear began 2 hours later. I had pulled into a designated rest stop about 30 miles further up the highway to stretch my legs and file my report. I was out of the car for maybe 5 minutes. The rest stop was completely empty, a small island of artificial light surrounded by miles of darkness. When I walked back to my patrol car, my blood ran cold. There, on the hood of my locked vehicle, was the exact same spiral pattern of river stones and coyote teeth. I hadn't heard a thing. I did a full sweep of the area, weapon drawn, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was impossible. This wasn't a prank. It was a message. It meant they had been watching me, at the first sight, had followed me, and had approached my car without making a sound. It was personal. Against my better judgment and every tactical instinct, I felt a pull. Not just curiosity, but a sense of duty. Who was doing this? Were they a threat to others? From the edge of the rest stop's light, I heard something. A faint, rhythmic sound. It wasn't a chant, more like a low, guttural humming. I switched off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight, and moved into the trees, my boots crunching softly on the pine needles. I crept forward until I reached the edge of a small clearing. What I saw there has never left me. About a dozen figures, cloaked in dark, heavy robes that hid their faces, stood in a silent circle. In the center of the circle, on a large flat slab of granite, they were methodically placing more of the stones and teeth, creating another intricate pattern under the moonlight. Their movements were synchronized and silent, save for that bone-deep humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I was so focused, I didn't pay attention to my footing. My boot came down on a dry twig, and it snapped with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent night. Instantly, the humming stopped. Every single hooded head turned in my direction. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel their collective gaze lock onto me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for noise, my only thought to get back to the safety of my car. I could hear nothing behind me, no footsteps, no pursuit, and that was the most terrifying part. It felt like they didn't need to chase me. I sped away from that rest stop, pushing my cruiser to its limit, and didn't stop until I was back in the city limits. I never filed a report. What would I have said? That I was scared off by artists in the woods. A week went by, and the terror began to fade, replaced by annoying uncertainty. I started to believe I had imagined the worst of it. Then, I found an envelope tucked into my locker at the barracks. It had my name on it, but no postage. Inside, there was no note, just a single, polished river stone. They knew my name, they knew where I worked, and they knew that I had seen them. Story 3. The tenant in 4B. My name is Officer Calloway. I've worked the night shift in a sprawling, anonymous suburb for most of my career. The kind of place where the uniform is supposed to mean something, to project an aura of control. One night, that illusion was shattered. The call was a welfare check, as mundane as they come. An elderly woman hadn't heard from her son in several days and was worried. The address was a low-rise apartment complex called the Regent, a grim, concrete block of a building known for its transient residents and the faint smell of decay that clung to its hallways. The moment I stepped out of my patrol car, I felt a heaviness in the air. The parking lot was nearly empty, and an unusual number of windows were dark. My radio, which had been clear just a block away, was now sputtering with interference. I made my way to the 4th floor, to apartment 4B. The hallway was dead quiet, the threadbare carpet absorbing all sound. I knocked on the door. Police department, doing a welfare check on Mr. Harris. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. The silence that answered was profound. I tried the handle and, to my surprise, it turned. Door was unlocked. I pushed the door open and announced my presence again. The apartment was strange. It was a small one-bedroom unit, but it was obsessively, unnaturally clean. The cheap linoleum floor shone as if it had just been polished. The few pieces of furniture, small couch, a coffee table, a television were perfectly arranged, angled in a way that felt staged. There was no dust, no clutter, no sign that anyone actually lived there. It felt like a showroom for furniture. No one would ever buy. A cold, clinical feeling of wrongness crept over me. From the single bedroom, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. "Sir, this is the police. Are you okay?" I asked, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. The tapping stopped. A man's voice, soft and strangely flat, answered, "I'm in here. I've been waiting." The phrase hung in the air, wrong and unsettling. I pushed the bedroom door open. A man was sitting on the edge of a perfectly made bed. He was pale and thin, dressed in simple gray clothes. He just sat there, staring at the wall, his hands folded in his lap. "Are you Mr. Harris?" I asked. He nodded slowly, never looking at me. "I was expecting you," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They said you would come." Suddenly, the apartment's front door slammed shut behind me with a deafening boom. I spun around, my weapon now drawn and pointed down the short hallway. I heard the distinct, heavy sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. My heart seized. I turned back to the man on the bed. He hadn't moved, but a faint, thin smile was now playing on his lips. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, still not looking at me. "This is a quiet place. We like to keep it that way." Footsteps started to sound from the apartment above me and below me, and next door, slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps, all converging. My radio was useless static. My cell phone had no signal. I was in a concrete box, 4 stories up, and the building was coming alive around me. I ran to the front door, ignoring the man, and futilely twisted the locked deadbolt. I was trapped. I made a decision. I wasn't dying in that hallway. I ran to the bedroom window, smashed it with the butt of my flashlight, and scrambled out onto the narrow fire escape, cutting my hands on the glass. I didn't look back into the room. I flew down the rusty stairs, my boots clanging a frantic rhythm of escape. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, gasping for air in the neon glow of a 24-hour convenience store. The next day, I convinced my sergeant to send a day shift unit with me to the Regent. We found apartment 4B. The door was unlocked, the window was intact, and the entire apartment was empty. Not just of people, but of all furniture. It was a vacant unit, and according to the building manager, it had been for over a year. I later spent hours in the public records archive. Over the last 2 decades, the Regent had an unusually high number of missing persons reports filed by out-of-state relatives. At least a dozen people, all single men, had moved in and then simply ceased to be. Their cars were left in the lot, their mail piled up, until they were eventually forgotten. The welfare call I received was never logged. It was a call from nowhere, to lure me to a place that collects people. Story 4. The symbol in the Moreau. My name is Ben, and I worked for the state's Fish and Wildlife Service. My patrol area covered hundreds of square miles of dense national forest. My job wasn't about people, it was about the environment. I tracked poaching activity, monitored animal populations, and made sure hikers and campers didn't get themselves killed. I loved the solitude, the feeling of being in a place governed by the laws of nature. That sense of peace was shattered one autumn afternoon. I was deep in the backcountry following a game trail that wasn't on any of my maps. when I found the first one. It was a white-tailed deer, or what was left of it. The carcass was laid out on a bed of ferns, but it wasn't the work of any predator I'd ever seen. It had been systematically and surgically dismantled. The organs were gone, the hide was gone, and the skeleton had been arranged. The ribs were cracked open and bent into a spiral, and the leg bones were stacked like firewood. It was clean, precise, and utterly sickening. Over the next mile, I found 2 more, both in the same ritualistic condition. This wasn't poaching. This was something else, something deeply wrong. I photographed the scenes, collected what samples I could, and hiked back to my truck, a growing sense of unease making the familiar forest feel alien and threatening. I felt watched, the way an animal does when a predator is near. I dismissed it as paranoia, a natural reaction to the gruesome discovery. I reached my truck, parked in a secluded clearing miles from any road, and was about to stow my gear when I saw it tucked under my windshield wiper was my own topographical map of the area. Someone had taken it from my passenger seat. I was sure I had left it there and drawn a symbol on it in what looked like charcoal. It was a circle with a vertical line drawn through the center. The symbol was drawn directly over the area where I had just found the deer carcasses. My truck had been locked. They had been there, they had watched me, and they had left me a warning that my training screamed at me to get in the truck and leave, to report it and come back with a full team. But a stubborn mix of duty and morbid curiosity took over. I heard a sound then, a faint, rhythmic chopping from deeper in the woods, in the direction of the marked area. Thinking it might be illegal loggers, I grabbed my rifle and moved cautiously towards the noise, my paranoia now replaced with a cold, focused dread. I moved from tree to tree until I could peer into a small, secluded meadow. There were 5 or 6 people there. They were dressed in simple, earth-toned work clothes, not the robes of my imagination. They looked like normal people, but what they were doing was anything but normal. They had another deer and they were using hand tools, hatchets, and saws, methodically take it apart with the same surgical precision as the others. They worked in complete silence, their movements efficient and practiced. In the center of their circle, a fire burned, and one of them was taking the long bones, cracking them open, and using a thin, sharp tool to scrape the marrow into a clay bowl. On the bowl was painted the same symbol that was on my map. I was completely hidden, my breathing shallow. I raised my camera to take a picture, to get evidence of whatever this was. As I focused the lens, one of the figures, a tall woman with long braided hair, stopped what she was doing. She didn't look around. She looked straight up, directly at my position, as if she could see right through the dense foliage hiding me. Her eyes locked with mine. There was no surprise in them, no anger, just a flat, cold recognition. She raised a single, blood-stained hand and pointed right at me. The others stopped working and slowly turned their heads in my direction. I didn't need any more encouragement. I ran. I didn't care about noise. I just crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, expecting to hear them chasing me, but there was only silence. I made it to my truck, threw myself in, and drove until the forest was a green blur in my rearview mirror. I thought I had escaped. I was wrong. The threat from them was never about a chase. 2 weeks later, after I'd been transferred to a different district at my own request, I came home to my small, isolated cabin. Sitting on my front porch, placed squarely in the center of the welcome mat, was a small, crudely made bowl. It was filled with a dark, fatty substance, and painted on its side, in what I knew was blood, was a circle with a vertical line through its center. Story 5. The people of Last Light. My name is Deputy Reed, and I work for a sheriff's office in rural northern Arizona. The landscape out here is beautiful, but it's also a place where people can disappear. We get calls all the time from folks back east, worried about a relative who went off-grid and stopped communicating. So when a call came in about a man who had joined a small, self-sufficient community called Last Light and hadn't been heard from in 6 months, it was treated as routine. I was tasked with driving out to their settlement to make contact and confirm his well-being. The community was located at the end of a long, dusty road, miles from the nearest highway. My radio signal died about halfway there, which was standard for this part of the county. I found the entrance marked by a simple wooden gate, beside which stood a small guard shack. A man emerged as I pulled up. He was gaunt, with deeply tanned skin and placid, unblinking eyes. He introduced himself as the gatekeeper. I explained my purpose, and he nodded slowly. "You are welcome to enter, Deputy," he said in a quiet, almost monotone voice. "But our ways are not your ways. We value silence. Please be respectful." His demeanor was strange, not hostile, but unnervingly serene. He opened the gate, and I drove through, a feeling of deep unease settling over me. The community of Last Light was built in a small, arid valley. It consisted of about 24 small, identical cabins, a central meeting hall, and carefully tended gardens. What was immediately striking was the utter silence. There were no voices, no sounds of work, no children playing. The other thing was its impossible tidiness. The pathways were perfectly swept, the gardens were free of a single weed, and the cabins looked freshly painted. It felt sterile and artificial, like a model town. As I got out of my car, I saw people. They were sitting on their porches or standing in their yards, completely still. They were all dressed in the same simple, gray homespun clothes. They didn't turn to look at me. They just stared straight ahead, their expressions as placid and empty as the gatekeepers. I approached the first cabin, where a woman sat in a rocking chair on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Ma'am, Deputy Reed, I'm looking for a Mr. James Sullivan." She didn't respond, she didn't even blink. I moved closer and saw the truth. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality. Her eyes, though open, were glassy and unfocused. She wasn't alive. She was a body, expertly preserved, posed like a mannequin. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. I moved to the next cabin and looked through the window. Inside, a family of 4 sat around a dinner table, hands folded, with the same waxy skin and dead open eyes. They were all like that. The entire community. It was a town of the dead, a grotesque tableau of peaceful life. The main door of the meeting hall opened, and the gatekeeper stepped out, along with 2 other men who looked just as gaunt and alive as he did. They were the only living ones. "He is here with us," the gatekeeper said, his voice echoing in the dead silence. He gestured towards one of the cabins. James found his peace. He joined the quiet, just like everyone else. He smiled, a dry, cracking expression. "We were hoping you would stay, Deputy. We have a place all ready for you. You look tired. You could use the rest." The 2 men with him began to walk towards me, their movements slow but deliberate. They weren't holding weapons, but I knew with chilling certainty what they intended to do. I didn't draw my weapon. I just ran. I sprinted back to my car, my boots kicking up dust on the pristine pathways as I passed the silent, watching corpses. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and threw the car in reverse, spraying gravel as I sped back towards the gate. The gatekeeper stood there as I approached, not moving to stop me, just watching with that same serene, terrifying emptiness. I swerved around him and crashed through the flimsy wooden gate, not stopping until I was back on the highway, and the static on my radio had turned back into the voice of dispatch. I later found a single mention of the original cult in an old digitized newspaper from the 1980s. They were a doomsday group who believed that by achieving a perfect state of stillness and preserving the body at the moment of enlightenment, they could cheat death. The article said the group had disbanded decades ago. It was wrong, they hadn't disbanded. They were just very, very quiet. Story 6. The Watcher on Route 86. My name is Fuentes. I was a state trooper whose patrol zone was a 100-mile stretch of State Route 86. A black ribbon of asphalt laid across the Arizona desert. It's a lonely, hypnotic place to work, a shift you can drive for an hour and not see another soul. Your world shrinks to the beam of your headlights and the crackle of the radio. One night, under a full white moon, I saw something that pulled me out of that hypnotic state. About 30 yards off the road, something caught my headlights. It was a structure, if you could call it that. It was a spindly, 10-foot-tall tripod, made of sun-bleached animal bones and rusted scrap metal, all lashed together with wire. Hanging from its center, twisting slowly in the breeze, was a mobile made of smaller bones and jagged pieces of colored glass. It was clearly man-made, but it had an ancient totemic feel to it. It was an anomaly, a piece of weird desert art. I took a quick photo, logged it as illegal dumping, and drove on, thinking it was just another strange thing in a strange land. I didn't know it was a territorial marker. I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. A few hours later, I pulled over at a scenic viewpoint to catch up on paperwork and rest my eyes. I must have drifted off for a few minutes. When I blinked myself awake, I saw a small white square tucked under my driver's side windshield wiper. My heart began to pound. I had been asleep, vulnerable. I got out, my hand on my pistol, and scanned the empty desert. Nothing, just rocks and saguaros under the moonlight. I pulled the object from my windshield. It was a Polaroid photograph. The image was grainy and overexposed from the flash, but it was unmistakably the interior of my patrol car. It was a picture of me, asleep in the driver's seat, my head tilted, back against the headrest. It had been taken just minutes ago, from just outside my window. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, flooded my system. I was being watched, toyed with. I scanned the darkness again, and this time I saw it. A faint trail of footprints in the sand, leading away from my car and deeper into the desert. My training told me to stay with my vehicle, to call for backup, but I was angry, and I was scared. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and followed the tracks, my boots crunching in the gravel. The footprints led me for nearly half a mile, over a small ridge and down into a shallow, hidden arroyo. From the top of the ridge, I looked down and saw them, 3 figures. They were rail-thin and dressed in dark, ragged clothing that blended with the shadows. They weren't doing anything overtly threatening. They were just digging in the dry earth with their bare hands, their movements frantic and bird-like under the moonlight. I stayed low, my breath held tight in my chest. What were they digging for, or what were they burying? One of them stopped, digging, and stood up straight, their head cocked as if listening. They turned their head slowly, methodically, and their gaze swept across the ridge until it landed directly on my position. There was no way they could have seen me, but they had. The figure let out a high-pitched, chittering sound, and the other 2 instantly stopped digging and looked up at me. There was no confrontation, no challenge, just silent, predatory awareness. Then they started moving towards the ridge. Their movements unnaturally fast, scrambling up the loose rock with a speed that wasn't human. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I scrambled back towards the highway. I could hear the skittering of rocks behind me, the sound of their pursuit. I burst out of the desert and onto the empty road, my lungs burning. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and sped away, watching the mirrors. I never saw them emerge from the darkness. They had simply stopped at the edge of the road, letting me go. The next morning, back at my apartment in a town 50 miles away, I found something on my doorstep. It was a small, carefully constructed sculpture, a miniature version of the tripod I had first seen. It was made of bird bones and scraps of tin, and at its base was a small, white Polaroid photograph of my apartment building's front door. A picture taken from across the street, a message: "We know who you are, we know where you live, and this is our land, not yours." Story 7, The Hunter's Cabin. My name is Rob. For a while, I was a state trooper patrolling the mountain passes in Colorado. It's a beautiful but unforgiving environment, especially in winter. One night, a blizzard hit earlier and harder than forecasted. Dispatch got a call about a car that had slid off the road and was stuck in a snowbank high up on Wolf Creek Pass. By the time I got near the location, the snow was coming down so thick I could barely see past my hood. My radio was all static, and the pass was officially closed behind me. I was on my own. I found the car, a small sedan half buried in snow. It was empty. There were tracks leading away from it, heading further up the pass, deeper into the storm. Standard procedure is to assume the occupant is trying to find shelter and to follow. So, I started walking, my flashlight cutting a weak beam through the swirling snow. The wind was howling and the cold was biting through my uniform. After about 20 minutes of fighting through the blizzard, I was about to turn back when I saw it. A faint yellow light flickering through the trees, a cabin dot. It was a small, rustic log cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked like a postcard of safety and warmth. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knocked on the solid oak door, and a moment later it was opened by an old man. He had a big, white beard, kind eyes, and was wearing a flannel shirt. He looked like the quintessential friendly mountain man. He introduced himself as Jedediah and listened to my story with a concerned nod. "Got yourself in a real blow, son," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Come on in, get warm. The storm will break by morning. You're safe here." He refused to go with me to look for the driver, saying the storm was too fierce. "If they're smart," he said, "they'll hold up just like us." It seemed reasonable at the time. The cabin was warm and cozy. A fire crackled in the hearth. The place was meticulously clean. The wooden floors swept, and a simple meal of stew was simmering on the wood stove. Jedediah was a gracious host, but there was an odd stillness to him, a strange formality in the way he spoke. He didn't ask much about me, but instead told long, rambling stories about the mountain. As I sat by the fire, trying to warm my frozen bones, my eyes wandered around the room. On a high shelf, catching the firelight, was a row of what looked like leather-bound journals. There were at least a dozen of them, all identical. When Jedediah went to the kitchen to ladle out some stew, a morbid curiosity got the better of me. I stood on a stool and pulled one of the journals down. It wasn't a diary, it was a logbook. The inside cover was labeled Pass Log, Winter 98. I flipped it open. It was filled with dated entries, each one written in precise, neat handwriting. The first entry I read said, January 12th, stranded motorist, male, mid-40s, took shelter, stayed the night. The next entry, dated the following day, was chillingly simple, January 13th, hunted at dawn, a good sport. I flipped through the pages. It was all the same, a date, a description of a stranded person, a hiker, a driver, a lost tourist, then a second entry describing a hunt. My blood turned to ice. These weren't journals, they were trophies. I looked at the last entry in the book. It was dated today, November 21st. State trooper, young, strong, seems capable. The storm is a gift. My heart stopped. I heard the floorboards creak behind me. Jedediah was standing there, holding a bowl of stew in one hand. In his other hand, he held a long, cruelly curved skinning knife. The kind smile was gone from his eyes, replaced by a flat, predatory gleam. "Findin' some good reddin'?" he asked, his voice losing its gentle rumble. "I was hoping you'd stay for breakfast." I threw the heavy journal at him and ran for the door. He lunged, but I was faster. I burst back out into the blizzard, the freezing wind a welcome shock compared to the suffocating horror of that cabin. I didn't care about the cold or the snow anymore. I just ran, blindly, stumbling down the mountain, fueled by pure terror. I eventually found my way back to my patrol car and managed to get it turned around, driving recklessly until I was off the pass. When a full team went up the next day after the storm had cleared, they found the cabin. It was empty. There was no sign of Jedediah, but in the hearth they found the charred remains of a dozen leather-bound journals. A search of the area later uncovered the remains of multiple individuals, spanning back decades. The missing driver from the sedan was among them. I had stumbled into a predator's den, and he had simply let me run, knowing the storm was just as likely to finish the job for him. Story 8. The Cove of Silent Tides. My name is Frank. I spent the last decade of my career on harbor patrol in a quiet coastal region of the Pacific Northwest. My job was mostly safety checks, dealing with boaters who'd had a bit too much to drink, and occasionally assisting the Coast Guard. Most nights were spent in a state of peaceful boredom. Just me, my boat, and the dark water. But there's a different kind of isolation on the water at night. The land feels miles away, and you feel like you're floating in an endless black void. It was on one of those nights that I saw something that didn't belong. I was doing a final sweep of my patrol area, a network of coves and inlets that were usually deserted after sundown. In a remote cove known as Whistler's Reach, my spotlight caught the reflection of a boat where no boat should have been. It was an old, wooden, fishing vessel, a trawler, but something was off. It sat low in the water, and there were no lights on, no engine noise. It was a ghost on the waves. As I idled closer, my own engine allowed intrusion in the stillness. I noticed its wake. It was moving, but with an eerie silence. It had been modified with modern near-silent electric engines. This wasn't some lost fisherman. This was deliberate concealment. I hailed them over the radio, no response. I hailed them over my boat's loudspeaker. Nothing but silence. I was about to write it off as a poacher trying to avoid me when my spotlight illuminated a detail that made the hair on my arms stand up. Placed carefully on the console of my own boat, right next to my GPS screen, was a dead seagull. A single piece of thick tarred rope was tied around its leg in a complex three-looped knot. I hadn't seen or heard anyone approach my vessel. It was an impossible, intimate violation of my space. A clear, direct warning. Back off. My fear was now warring with my duty. I cut my own engine, letting my boat drift, and watched the trawler through my binoculars. It wasn't fishing. It slid silently to the center of the cove and stopped. Figures emerged on its deck. They were dressed in the dark, heavy rain gear of fishermen, their faces obscured by shadows and hoods. They moved with a practiced efficiency, using a small crane to winch a large, heavy crate from their hold. The crate was made of a dark, wet wood, and it seemed to hum with a low energy that I could feel more than hear. As they lowered it over the side, I saw strange, phosphorescent symbols glowing faintly on its surface. They gently placed the crate into the water, and it sank without a splash, disappearing into the black depths. I was hidden in the darkness, But one of the figures on the deck suddenly stopped and lifted a pair of binoculars, scanning the water. It was a clear moonless night, but he swept them back and forth before his gaze locked directly onto my boat. He held the stare for a long moment, then lowered the binoculars and raised a hand, pointing directly at me. In that instant, the silent engines of the trawler roared to life, not with a hum, but with the powerful growl of a conventional diesel engine they had clearly kept hidden. They weren't being stealthy anymore. They were coming for me. A chase ensued. My patrol boat was faster and more maneuverable, but their heavy trawler was surprisingly quick, and it cut through the water with a brutal force, aiming to swamp or ram me. It was a terrifying chase through the dark, narrow inlets. I managed to outmaneuver them, using my knowledge of the shoals to escape into the open water where they couldn't follow without risk of running aground. I made it back to the main dock, my heart pounding, and filed a detailed report. The official investigation found nothing. The trawler was gone. Sonar sweeps of the cove found no crate. It was as if it never happened. I transferred to a desk job. Soon after, the nights on the water no longer holding any peace for me. The terror, I thought, was over, but the true horror of that encounter was its patience. A month later, I went down to my personal boat, which I kept at a private marina miles from my old patrol zone, tied to the cleat on the bow, flapping gently. In the sea breeze was a single piece of thick tarred rope. It was tied in a perfect 3-looped knot. They knew who I was, they knew where I lived, and they wanted me to know that whatever they had sunk into that cove was a secret they would protect. That chase had never really ended. The darkness at the edge of town is not empty. It holds secrets, and sometimes it develops an appetite. The officers in these stories were armed, trained, and prepared for the dangers of the human world, but they were not prepared for places where the rules are different, where a knock on the door is an invitation to a trap, and where a random discovery is a trespass that will not be forgiven. The true horror is not always in the confrontation, but in the lingering knowledge that follows. A stone in a locker, a knot on a rope, the quiet understanding that you have seen something you shouldn't have, and that you have been seen in return. The world is a little thinner for them now, the darkness a little deeper. Thank you for joining me in the shadows tonight. If these stories have left you with a sense of unease, remember to lock your doors, and be grateful for the silence. Until next time, stay safe, and be wary of the quiet places. Don't forget to subscribe for more true horror from Dr. Bonechill.